Masechet Ketubot Daf Ayin Gimel. We're speaking about this Mishnah that someone does Kiddushin on condition that his wife has no vows. And turns out she does have vows, so retroactively, the Kiddushin was never valid because the condition was not met. If they get married without any condition, and it turns out she has vows, so the marriage is a marriage because there's no condition. But since she did have vows and he didn't want her to have vows, so she can divorce her and does not have to pay her ketubah. Okay, there's two ways to read this: as two separate cases, or as one continuous case. At first he does Kiddushin with a condition, and then he does Nisu'in without a condition. We're going to see that the two ways to read that are going to depend on the following machloket. Itmar kid sha al tenai uchnasa stam. Someone who does Kiddushin with a condition, but then the marriage is without a condition. In other words, reading our Mishnah in a continuous way. Rav Amad Siricha Hemenu Get, Ushmel Amad Ena Siricha Hemenu Get. Rav says they require a get. Meaning that the marriage is a marriage. Presumably, it looks like Rav, the reason for Rav is that even though the Kiddushin was with a condition, once he did the marriage and he didn't repeat the condition at the marriage, it looks like he's foregoing on that condition. He's changing his mind. Okay, that's what we would presume right now, although we're going to correct that in a minute. Shmuel says he does not need a get because the Kiddushin was on a condition, so we assume the condition continues, and when they do the marriage, the Nisu'in also depends on the very same condition as before, and therefore, if it turns out that condition is not fulfilled, let's say if it's vows, that she has vows, then no need for a get retroactively. They were never married. Amad Abaye. Now, Abaye is going to be one of two interpretations of the machlokah between Rav and Shemuel. So Abaye says, "Lo tema ta'ameh derav kevan shekenasa stam achole achle litnae." Do not think what you would think with the way I explained it just now, that the reason of Rav is because once they marry without any condition, so that means he is foregoing his condition. And so even though he made the Kiddushin with a condition, but then the Nisu'in, if he doesn't repeat it, it means that he just wants to marry her. No, don't think that. Because if you think that, then the Mishnah wouldn't make sense. So look at the Mishnah here. It says that once he does this, he marries her without a condition, he can divorce her, but without a ketuvah. If he foregoes the condition, then he should have to pay the ketuvah. So that can't be the reason. Instead, going back to Rava's explanation, Abaye's explanation, is that rather, Ela tamad Rav, lefi she'en adam oseh bi'ilato be'ilat zenut. It's because a person does not want his relations to be one of promiscuity. If someone has relations, he wants it to be within the context of proper marriage. Therefore, even though he did make a condition at the time of Kiddushin, and that condition would be effective until Nisu'in, if he would find out that she had vows, and then retroactively, that Kiddushin would be nothing. However, once he does Nisu'in and consummates the marriage through Bi'ah, so that means that he doesn't want retroactively the Kiddushin to be nothing, because then his Bi'ah would be promiscuous. And he's not that kind of guy. He's an upstanding man. And so therefore, he does not want the condition to kick in. Nevertheless, even though he doesn't want the Kiddushin to be retroactively annulled, it doesn't matter. That doesn't mean that he forgoes his concern about vows. He still wants to make sure she has no vows. Therefore, the ketuvah payment is still dependent on her not having vows. Right? He does still care about it, so they are fully married. But if it turns out she has vows, then you could say, oh, listen, but the ketuvah payment, that was on condition that you have no vows. So that is the reason. So it's mostly because what he has in mind when he consummates the marriage in Bi'ah. Okay. Ha peligi ba hada zimna. Whereas, on the other hand, Shemuel, according to this explanation, would say that he did the kiddushin on condition, and then when he does nisuin, he doesn't mind that it also be a conditional nisuin. And if it turns out that she has vows, then retroactively it will turn out that marriage, that bi'ah, was not in the context of marriage, but rather was promiscuous. Shemuel would say a person would rather that than have to be stuck in such a marriage. He would rather the marriage not to have been there at all. Okay, now we ask this machlok between Rav and Shemuel. We already saw it another time. Why do we need to know about it twice? A minor girl whose father died and she is married off by her mother or her brother. That's a conditional or dirabanan marriage. She has a right to refuse. So it's conditional on her not refusing. That's why it's similar to this case. It's not actually conditional marriage, just that it is a marriage dirabanan until unless she refuses, until she's an adult. Once she's an adult, if they have bi'ah after that, with intention that this will make it a biblical marriage, then they are biblically married. So she becomes an adult, and then let's say she goes and does a marriage ceremony with a second guy without getting a divorce in between. So what's the status? Rav Amar en sricha get misheni. Rav says she doesn't need to get from the second guy because she's fully married to the first guy. Anytime if a woman is fully married to one guy, any kiddushin or nisuin, she could do 100 ceremonies with someone else. It's not going to do anything. She's already taken. So Rav here says, even though her marriage originally was in Dirabanan, once she becomes an adult, a man's not going to want his relations to be that of outside the context of marriage. So therefore, he's going to have in mind that immediately after she becomes an adult, the next bi'ah will be for the sake of making their marriage biblical. Therefore, they're biblically married, fully married, and that's why the second so-called marriage is not a marriage at all and doesn't need any get. Ushmel Amar Siricha get misheni. Shemuel says that the husband, the first husband, when he has a bi'ah, even after she becomes an adult, doesn't necessarily have in mind that it's going to be for biblical. He wants to continue the same relationship, the same as it was when she was a minor. It's a rabbinic relation. It's a rabbinic marriage, and therefore, if she goes and gets married to another guy, that biblical marriage can be valid. And therefore, she would require a get from the second husband. So you see that both of these controversies are based on the same fundamental premise, whether a person will allow a bi'ah to be outside the context of marriage. Rav says no, and Shemuel says yes. Okay, so why do I need both of them? If I only knew the case over there regarding the minor girl who grows up. Maybe that's where Rav says that it becomes a biblical marriage. A person does have in mind that it should be a full marriage because there's no condition. It's a marriage unless she refuses. So that's where he would say that yes, it becomes a full marriage. Aval beha, but in the case of a condition where he says kiddushin is only on condition that you don't have a vow, maybe in that case I might think that I would agree with Shemuel that the condition continues and he doesn't want to be married to her and doesn't want even the nisuin to be valid if she has a vow. So that's why I need the case here regarding the conditional kiddushin. B'itmar beha, and if I only had the one here regarding conditional kiddushin, beha kama Shemuel. Oh, maybe I might think that only here Shemuel says that the nisuin is undone, and he continues his condition even to the nisuin, and he's okay with his bi'ah being outside of marriage because it's all unconditioned. He really doesn't want vows. But in the case of the minor who grows up where there's no condition, maybe he would agree with Rav that as soon as she grows up, the next bi'ah, he will have in mind that this will be for a biblical marriage, and therefore would not require get from the second Saricha. So that's why I need to this case also to teach that Shemuel disagrees in this case. All right. Okay, now that we understand that, we're going to ask a question against Shemuel from the language in our Mishnah. תנן, כנסה סתם ונמצאו עליה נדרים, תעשה שלא בכתובה. כתובה הוא דלה בעיה, הגיתה בעיה. So in the second clause in our Mishnah, it says that if someone marries without any condition, and turns out that there were vows, so he can divorce her, and it does not pay a ketuvah. So we can infer, he doesn't have to pay a ketuvah, but you do need a get. But so why do you need a get? According to Shemuel, right? You just said, we're reading the cases continuously in the Mishnah. He did a kiddushin on condition, and then he did the marriage with no condition. That's the case that Rav and Shemuel are talking about. And according to Shemuel, she should not require a get retroactively. The Kiddushin was not good, and that continues into the Nisuin, which was also on condition. So, my love, Kiddishal Tenayuch Nasas Setam, Tiyubta de Shemuel, right? Aren't we talking about here in the Mishnah? Our very case of when they did Kiddushin on condition, and the marriage was without saying anything, and this would challenge Shemuel. And we answer, Lo kiddusha stam uchnasa stam. No, the second clause of the Mishnah is not necessarily continuing the first clause. It's saying something else. It's its own case. It's a case where they did kiddushin without condition, nisuin without condition. Because there was no condition, that's why the kiddushin is valid, the nisuin is valid. So therefore, there's no retroactive undoing. He has to give a get. Nevertheless, because she makes these vows, and we can assume people don't want these such vows that their wife will have. Therefore, he doesn't have to pay a ketuvah. Still needs a get. Okay, good. But now, still a question of how Shemuel is going to interpret the first clause. Aval kiddusha al tenai uchnasa stam hachinameh delo bayaget. So Shemuel, you're saying that if he did kiddushin on condition, even though the marriage was without any condition, then you would not require a get because the kiddushin was never valid. And he never had in mind that the nisuin would be a standalone. It's so dependent on the condition as well. So, then I have a question. How come the Mishnah gives only a simple case? The Mishnah could have given a bigger chidush. Why does the Mishnah only talk about a case where someone did Kiddushin on condition that she has no vows? And turns out she has vows, and in that case, the Kiddushin is not valid. Litneh kenasastam benimseu aleha nedarim ena mekudeshet v'kol shekenha. Tell me a case where she did the Kiddushin on condition, but then also got married without a condition. And even though after the condition, she got married without a condition, nevertheless, retroactively, the marriage is nothing, and then the Kiddushin never happened. And then I'll know for sure that in the simpler case of just a Kiddushin on condition without any subsequent marriage, for sure that would be undone. So why not? You should have talked about a bigger chidush if you really thought that, Shemuel. And so we answer, Hachinamikamad. You're right. In fact, we're going to reinterpret the Mishnah to include precisely that case, all within that first clause of the Mishnah. So the case, as the Mishnah says, someone who does Kiddushin on condition that there's no vows, and then we add in, and he also married her without any condition, and anyway, after that it turns out that she had vows, and Amikodeshet, there's no Kiddushin, right? That's fits with Shemuel, and that's the big Chiddush. And then it says, but if there was no condition on the Kiddushin and no condition on the Nisuin, and she has vows, then the marriage is valid. It's just that he doesn't have to pay the Ketubah, because we can assume that men in general will not want those certain types of vows that we mentioned yesterday. Good. Ketubah hu de la baya ha gita baya. We now ask a more fundamental question regarding Shemuel's interpretation of the Mishnah. If a man does Kiddushin and Nisuin without any condition, nevertheless, he does not have to pay a Ketubah. So we infer correctly that, he doesn't have to pay a Ketubah, but he does have to give a get. So we ask, Umay shena Ketubah de la ba'ya de amar ifshi be'isha nadranit ihachi get name lati ba'e. So what's the difference between that not paying Ketubah and requiring a get? Regarding the Ketubah, he doesn't have to pay because the man can say, I don't want a wife who makes vows. And therefore, even if I don't say that explicitly, we can assume that a man doesn't want a wife who's going to make vows that she's not wearing colored clothing or eating meat. So that's an implicit condition. If so, then regarding the get also, he could say, I don't want that. It's an implicit condition, and therefore he can claim that this is a kiddushet ta'ut. Just like if I buy something and you sell me something else, this is not the thing that I wanted to buy. And so therefore the sale is null and void. So too here, the Kiddushin should be null and void. If he doesn't have to pay the Ketubah because of an implicit condition, then we should say an implicit condition and not require a get either. Two answers. Amar Rabba, siricha get midibrehem. Vechen amar Rav Chisda, siricha get midibrehem. So Rabba Rav Chisda say that you're right, on the deoraita level, there is an implicit condition. Nevertheless, he didn't say the condition, and so it kind of looks like they are married. So midrabanan, we want to make sure that they get a get because everyone thought they were married, and we don't want to just going and remarrying without doing anything. Rava amar Tana sapuke mesapek aleh kabe mamona lekula kabe isura lechumra. Rava said it's not that it's a get midrabanan that's required, but rather a safek get. We're not sure. Tanaim were not sure whether this is we can apply that this implicit condition or not. And so therefore, when you have a safek mamon, so we can be lenient and say, well, you don't have to pay because, let her go and prove that you didn't care about this condition. And so she can't prove that. So safek, he doesn't have to pay. But regarding isur, we're still in safek. We're going to go let her marry someone else now when maybe she does, maybe she doesn't need a get from this other guy. So therefore, we have to be stringent when it comes to isur. All right, Amar Rabba, Machloket B'Taut Sheten Nashim. All that was the interpretation of Abaye regarding Rav and Shemuel. Now Rabba gives a completely different interpretation, that the Machloket between Rav and Shemuel is talking about a case of two women where one of them deceives him, meaning a case where a man, Yaakov, marries Leah on condition that she has no vows, and then they get divorced. That was a good marriage, but they got divorced, and then he marries Rachel without making a condition. So do we say that we continue the condition since he made a condition with the first one? So therefore, we assume that he's also wants to make a condition with the second one, even though he didn't say it. And if it turns out the second one, ta'ut here means that she tricked him, and she in fact does have a vow, then we know that since he made the condition in the first case, therefore the condition will be valid in the second case as well. That would be Shemuel's position. So therefore, there's no get required from the second guy. Whereas Rav would say, no, we cannot assume that. He made a condition with Leah, but he did not make a condition with Rachel. Therefore, even if it turns out that Rachel has vows, the marriage is still a valid marriage, and he would need to give her a get. That's what the machloket is. But aval beta'ut isha achat. But if it's talking about just one, it's plain case of one woman, Rachel and Leah, and he makes a conditional kiddushin, and then they get married. Dibra kol en sricha hemenu get. Everyone agrees that no get is required. Even Rav. In other words, according to Rabba's interpretation, Rav and Shemuel would agree in the case that Abaye said, that if you get married if you do Kiddushin on condition, and then get married without any condition, that even Rav would agree with Shemuel that everyone agrees that the condition of the Kiddushin continues, and the person did not want to be married at all. The marriage also is on condition, and therefore retroactively, if she has vows, it's undone and does not require a get. Okay, so that's Rabba's interpretation. Now Abaye is going to challenge it a few times. Amar le Abaye, v'hamatnitin de ta'ut isha achati, v'kamot binan tiyub tamineh. Abaye said, hold on. Do you remember in the discussion we just had that we challenged Shemuel based on our Mishnah. And our Mishnah is talking about a case of just one woman. The Mishnah doesn't say anything that is about two women. It doesn't say he got married to one, then got married to and divorced her, got married to a second. And yet we challenge Shemuel from it. That means we must be talking about a case of only one woman. Okay, this statement, by the way, is fascinating because Abaye is referring to an anonymous challenge that we had before. How do you know that Rava agrees to that challenge? It seems that both Abaye and Rava received a kind of skeleton sugya that had Rav's opinion, Shemuel's opinion, a challenge to Shemuel from our Mishnah. All that was already included, which means Abaye and Rava are responding to an anonymous question. So therefore, not all anonymous statements, even though most of them are from the later editors of the Talmud. Here is a case of an anonymous question that Rabba and Abaye both agree was already there before them, and they're just trying to figure out how it applies. Okay, so therefore we cannot. That can't be exactly what Rabbah said. Rather, maybe we just got Rabbah's interpretation a little bit off. And so here it is: Ela itmad hachi itmad. If Rabbah said something, he must have said the following, because it has to make sense. Amar Rabba machloket b'ta'ut isha achat ke'ayin shete nashim. The machloket between Rav and Shemuel is when you have an error or a deceit regarding one woman that is like two women. What does that mean? It means when there's only one woman involved, Yaakov and Leah, and they get married once on condition, and that marriage is good, she has no vows, but then they get divorced. After that, they get remarried, but in the remarriage of the same two people, he does not make a condition this time. So, should we assume that the condition of the first one continues, and then if she does have vows and the second marriage, Shemuel would say, yeah, it continues, and therefore the second marriage was never valid, and no need for divorce. Rav says he made a condition in the first marriage, but who said that he still wants the condition to hold? In the second marriage, maybe not. Therefore, they do need a get. That's the machloket. So now it's all one woman. We're assuming that our Mishnah is in fact talking about a case of this one woman like two women, where he married her, divorced, and remarried her. That's why we asked the question against Shemuel. But in a simple case where there's just one marriage to one woman, then for sure, even though the Kiddushin was on condition and the Nisu'in was not on condition, nevertheless, the Kiddushin is retroactively annulled if she has vows and no need for a get. All right, good. So now we at least have an understandable position of Rabbah, but Rabbah is going to challenge it anyway from a baraita. Itebe Abaye kiddusha betaut. This has a few cases, this baraita. The first one is relevant to us. If someone does Kiddushin in error here means that he thought that she didn't have a vow, but turns out she did have a vow. Right now we're assuming it means that there was a conditional marriage, but it turned out the condition was not true. Or if a man does Kiddushin with like a paperclip, and I guess thinking that it's good, but it's no good, it has to be at least worth the smallest denomination when he gives her money. Or a minor that does Kiddushin on his own, without his father involved, which is not a Kiddushin. Even though he sends gifts that are worth money afterwards, as when he becomes an adult, nevertheless, when he gives the gifts, doesn't have in mind that this will be for Kiddushin, and so that can't make up for the invalid Kiddushin that he made with a paperclip or when he was a minor. Because when he sends it, he's assuming that they already did Kiddushin. He thinks the Kiddushin was good, and these are just regular gifts. He doesn't think that these are gifts for Kiddushin. Vim ba'alu kanu, but at some point afterwards, if they do bi'ah, when she grows up, then that bi'ah will be considered a Kiddushin, because you could do Kiddushin not only through money, you could do it through bi'ah, and therefore he will have in mind that just in case the one before wasn't good, this will be the valid Kiddushin, and so they are married. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Ishmael Amar Im Ba'alu Lo Kanu. He said not necessarily, since he thought that they had Kiddushin, so he doesn't have in mind that he's doing the next Bi'ah for Kiddushin, and therefore they're actually not married. Okay, now going back to the the first case where he so ma'ila mishum ta'ut nedarim. So what kind of case are we talking about of an error? Isn't it that he made a condition that I want you not to have vows? It turned out that she didn't reveal that she had vows, but she did, and when he finds out, so then retroactively, it will not, that's the question, is it a Kiddushin or not? So here's exactly our case, because they do the Kiddushin on condition, but then they do have a Nisu'in, right? That's the Bi'ah that they have later, and they continue to live together. So there is a Bi'ah later without condition, and it's subject to a machloket between Tanaim. But Rabbi, you said that in a case where a simple case is no divorce, but just one woman, one wedding, that there is no controversy. Right here, there is a controversy about it. So what are you going to do with that? Rabba, Abaye asks, and he responds, Lo ta'ut pachut mishaveh peruta. No, the ta'ut case in the Baraita is actually talking about Kiddusha beta'ut is the same as pachot mishaveh peruta. He mistakenly thought that you can use less than a penny, even though that wasn't true. Okay, so we're not talking about a case of a conditional marriage because of vows. All right, pachot mishaveh peruta behedya katanila. How could you understand it that way? That's the very next case, is using less than a peruta. So we already have that case. Kedesha beta'utu pachot mishaveh peruta. We quote the Baraita. See, it has two cases. Perusheka mefaresh. We answer. One is an explanation of the second is an explanation of the verse. Kedesha beta'ut kesad. If one does a mistaken marriage, what kind of mistaken marriage? Kegon shekidesha bepachot mishaveh peruta. For example, he used something worth less than a peruta, thinking that it was okay. But in fact, this Braita is not talking about a conditional marriage at all, and so we resolve that question. All right, next. B'mai kami palge. Morris sabar adam yodea she'en kiddushin tofsin bepachot mishaveh peruta vegamar u'ba'al l'shem kiddushin. In this Braita, what is at the essence of their machloket? The Tanakama must think that a person actually knows that Kiddushin is not valid if you use less than the peruta. So even though they did this marriage ceremony, this Kiddushin ceremony, he knows that it was fake, and therefore, v'gamar ba'al l'shem Kiddushin. When they have bi'ah, he has in mind this will be actually for Kiddushin, and that's why after that they are married. Or more sabar, whereas Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says, "En adam yodea she'en Kiddushin tofsin b'chot mishaveh peruta." Not everybody studied Masechet Kiddushin. Not everybody knows that the marriage is invalid. He thinks that he gave her a paperclip, and that's fine. And therefore, when he does bi'ah, he assumes that they already had a valid kiddushin. He does not have in mind that this bi'ah will be for kiddushin. All right, good. Now that we explained that baraita, we have another question. Abaye against Rabbah. A man says, we're going to have bi'ah now, and this bi'ah should be for Kiddushin on condition that my father will agree to it. Now, and it turns out that the father doesn't. Tanakama says, even if the father did not agree to this marriage, and he doesn't like this girl or whatever reason he objects to it, nevertheless, they are mikudeshet, because we assume that a person does not want his bi'ah to be for promiscuity. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda omer mishum Rabbi Shimon dasa ha'av mikudeshet lo dasa ha'av ena mikudeshet. Rabbi Shimon says that if we follow his condition, if the condition is fulfilled, then the kiddushin is valid. If not, then it's not valid. Now this case, this is a second challenge to Rabbah by Abaye. Here's the case that is a mistaken marriage, just like in our case, it's a conditional marriage, basically saying that this kiddushin should be dependent on the following condition, and then they have bi'ah. So is it valid or not? And is a subject to a machloket. But Abba, you said that there is no machloket about a case of one man and one marriage, and so everyone should agree that the condition does apply, and the condition that he made continues to apply even as they have bi'ah and live together. So hatam b'hakami palge. So Rabbah can answer, no, this machloket there is about a different matter. Mor sabar al menat sheyirseh ha'ab al menat sheyishtok ha'ab v'hashatik le. When it says if my father agrees, what does it mean to agree, right? Is it not objecting or actually saying yes? So Tanakama, who say that they are married, he says that what he meant is that on condition that my father is quiet, doesn't object. And let's assume that the father was quiet, did not object, and therefore they are married. No, when according to the Bishimon, he meant if my father agrees, it means he has to agree positively and say, yes, I agree to this marriage. And he was just quiet. He didn't say yes. And that's why the condition is not fulfilled, and therefore they are not married. So their machloket depends on just a question of what does agreement mean. And but in fact, any condition that's made beforehand during Kiddushin, it does continue even during the Bi'ah. We continue with one more challenge on this daf, at least, is more on the next daf, from Abaye against Rabbah. Itibe, modim chachamim l'Rabbi Eliezer b'ktana shesi'ah abiha v'nit garsha. V'hi toma b'chayav v'chazira shecholeset v'lo mitjabemet. Although Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer disagree regarding Yibum cases, we're going to see, but they agree that if a minor, her father married this minor off, that marriage is a biblical marriage because a father has a biblical right to marry off his daughter, and they get married, they get divorced. She's still a minor, they get divorced. And now she is like an orphan, even though her father is alive. The law is that a father cannot marry her off biblically a second time. So if, while she's a minor, she goes and remarries that same guy, but this time it's only a rabbinic marriage, and let's say he dies without children, can she do yibum? She cannot do yibum. She has to do chalitza and not yibum, because on the biblical level, she is now no longer married to this guy, and therefore the brother would be her former husband's brother, which is her brother-in-law, and that would be erva. So not permitted, even though on the Drabanan level they are married. But the biblical level is more important here, so they have to do halitza. Her divorce from her first marriage is a full divorce. She can get fully divorced. Father accepts the divorce. But her second marriage to the same guy is not a full marriage. Good. The Braita continues. When is this true that there's no machloket? When she got divorced as a minor and remarried also as a minor, then the second marriage is d'Rabbanan. But if they got divorced when she was minor, but then the second marriage when she was an adult. As an adult, she has the power to make a full marriage. Or the second marriage was when she was a minor, but then she grew up during the marriage, became an adult, and they continued. They had bi'ah at least once after she grew up, and only then he died, umet. Then then she can do chalitza or yibum, meaning that because she grew up within the marriage, this last case, that's the significant one here, we assume that the bi'ah that they have after she grows up, he's going to have in mind and say, this will be for the full marriage. He wants it to be a full marriage, and so that will be the one that makes a deoraita marriage, and therefore they can do yibum. That's Tanakama. Mishum Rabbi Eliezer amru choleset velo mitjabemet. He says no. He still has to do chalitza, because how do you know? Maybe where he wanted to continue the marriage as it was as a minor, and did not have in mind that it should be for making this marriage into a deoraita marriage, and so it could still be that's the Rabbanan marriage. So now here's the question. This case is similar. Now it's not exactly the same as a conditional marriage, but it's similar in the sense that it's a marriage that's only the Rabbanan, and she can get out of it by refusing. So in that sense, it's kind of on condition, and then there's a bi'ah after that condition runs out. Once she's an adult, she cannot refuse anymore, and there is a bi'ah after. So you have a machloket here whether that bi'ah continues to be conditional or now is a new thing. And so since this is similar to the case of Rav and Shemuel, and Rabbah said that there is no controversy regarding a case where there was some kind of condition and then there was a bi'ah, but here there is a condition. That's a challenge to Rabbah, and we answer. There is a machloket here, but they're not arguing on whether the bi'ah after the condition continues the condition or not. They're arguing about something else. They're arguing about the literacy of most people. The first Tanakh here says, most people know that when you do Kiddushin with a minor and the father is not involved, even though this case is tricky because the father could be involved, but it's her second marriage. So everybody knows that this marriage is not a biblical marriage. Therefore, when she's an adult, he's going to have in mind that it's for Kiddushin, and therefore it's a full marriage. Whereas the Rabbi Eliezer does not think that people do not know that this Kiddushin was not good, and therefore when they do have bi'ah after she becomes an adult, he's assuming that they were already married, so he doesn't have in mind that this will be for marriage, and that's why it's just a matter of what he has in mind based on his knowledge of the law or lack of knowledge of the law, but in fact it's not related to Machloket Rav and Shemuel, and so Rabbah is able to defend himself once again. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.